Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience. I know that my progress with this new series, Beginning Theory, is not as fast as I like it to be, but we are making progress. My original plan for this part three in the series, is to cover psychoanalysis, Freud and Lacan. But first, I want to respond to a couple of questions, a few questions raised by Mike and Chris. So let me talk about those questions. If my responses to those questions are too long, then we will cut here and this will be a separate video, and then psychoanalysis will come in the next part. These questions are important, and I think the fact that they were raised at all, to some extent, it shows that I was not clear enough. And this topic itself, it's very difficult to be clear, precise, like scientifically precise with. But I could have done a better job. Another reason is that these are really important and central questions in our discussion. So let's begin with a question from Mike. Mike wanted a little bit of clarification, more clarification about this distinction between liberal humanism that I call the default position, the pre-theoretical position, and structuralism, which is the first step in the history of so-called theory, academic theory. That part of that question is, why do we call the liberal humanism position the default? Why do we recognize that as default? Does that mean it is more common? Does it mean it is what comes to us most easily, even though it might not be as common? In the structure of the book, Peter Barry's book, liberal humanism is called theory before theory. So it is a theoretical stance, it is a theoretical attitude that existed at least in history of English studies, that existed before the emergence of structuralism and discourses similar to in the character of structuralist discourse. Now, let's pause and let's talk a little bit about what liberal humanism is, how it talks about. Certain ideas belong to the liberal humanist tradition, the liberal humanist attitude. These ideas, like when you read a novel, the idea of character belongs more comfortably in that attitude. The idea of the singularity of character, that a character is singular. The idea of choice in a story, just the very concept, the very idea of choice. The cultivation of freedom, cultivation of the capacity to make choices. So liberal humanism is concerned with the representation of these. I mentioned cultivation of freedom. Another phrase would be expression of individuality. Something that is harmonious, that fits really well with these sequence of phrases that I just put forth, is the idea of genius, singularity of an individual genius who has cultivated their individuality. The idea of art itself is more comfortably, I'm not saying that it doesn't belong in, or it's foreign to structuralism or to psychoanalysis, but it is more comfortable in the attitude of liberal humanism. Art itself, what art is closer to a given, closer to something that we can take for granted in liberal humanism. Art, the fact that we have this tendency to create works of art. Our default position is not to be skeptical of art. We won't say that this person is creating art because they have repressed their sexuality or because they are replicating patterns of production in the techno-capitalist system. This is not a default position. For some people, this might be the thing that comes to their mind more naturally. That might be their default position, but roughly, we are approximating the default position, the pre-theoretical position, where these concepts are not questions. They're not treated with skepticism, with suspicion. So liberal humanism is human-centered humanism. Human is at the center. Human is taken for granted. Regard for human being, for human as a kind of being that creates, a kind of being that deserves leisure, deserves respect, deserves dignity. You don't need to argue for these within liberal humanism. Now, with structuralism, we become skeptical. We start to shift our attitude, shift our lens. We become more sociological. We become more aware of what is happening in society, patterns in society, social patterns. We start to regard the individual as an indication of what is going on in society. We also become aware of historical patterns, historical trends, and we regard individual choices, individual action as indications, as examples, as representations of patterns that are larger than individuals, larger than singular human beings. So the idea of genius itself becomes something that is produced. We think about the idea of genius as something that, oh, what was the history of this idea? When did it arise? When did it become popular? What are the economic, cultural factors that make language, make our thoughts hospitable to this idea of genius? Okay, so that's why I, in a tongue-in-cheek way, when I was talking about structuralism, I thought it might be fair to say that structuralism, compared with liberal humanism, structuralism is something akin to the fall of from innocence, the fall from the Garden of Eden, fall of man, because we become aware, we become sensitive to different modes of knowing, different modes of knowledge, and we lose our innocence, the innocence of our time before theory. Okay, so we move now to Chris. Chris asks about theory. He has this note in general about the importance of theory, the point in theory. And he mentioned a book that I really like. I haven't finished it, but I've read about half of it. A book by Michael Billig. The title of the book is More Examples, Less Theory, which is a simplification of what Billig is doing in that book. He doesn't say we shouldn't be theoretical. What he says is that our starting point should always be concrete situations. Concrete situations that always spill over our theoretical assumptions. In other words, he actually promotes, without really using these words, he promotes dialectical thinking, dialectical movement, moving between theory, between concepts and concrete things. So he's advocating for the primacy of examples. So when he's talking about Shaftesbury, for example, he talks about this example of a person is, putting his hand in his pocket and, just playing with the fluff that is in pocket. Exploring your pockets is to finding something or not finding something, just, moving your hand while thinking. These kinds of examples we're familiar with them, or, running into someone on the street that you know, but maybe you're not sure if the other person remembers you. So it's an ambiguous situation whether you should say hello to them, whether you should announce that you recognize them, you should greet them openly, or you should just pass by. These kinds of examples, because we are familiar with them, they are very useful reference points, but it's not just about familiarity. It is because examples are rich, as I'm sure Chris also knows this and appreciates this. So Billig and people who are against theory, what they are advocating is move towards the richness of examples, richness of concrete instances, because they continue to challenge our theories and enrich our theories, our theoretical activities. Chris writes, maybe in literature this isn't necessary, the move in the direction of examples and against theory. Maybe this isn't necessary because there's already so many examples embedded in the text, and you just need the theory to clarify them. Whereas in social science, it's the reverse. You have to provide all the examples which are needed to clarify the theory. Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. In social science, especially when social science becomes overly determined by theoretical debates, people sometimes create artificial examples that flesh out their theories instead of finding instances that are complicated, that are not artificial. What I want us to think about a little bit more is that clarification. Chris writes, there are lots of examples in works of fiction, for example. Lots of situations, lots of characters, lots of events and actions. Action is really a big thing. Lots of actions happen, lots of characters, character development. And Chris writes here that we need theory to clarify them. What does that mean? What does that clarification mean? Why do we need theory? That question should be alive in our minds. There is a completely valid position that says, I just need to read this book. I just want to read my novel. I don't need your theory, or I don't need anybody's theory. That's definitely a valid position. And, I wouldn't change somebody's mind if that is their position. So there's a dialectic between text and theory, and that dialectic happens. I think it happens even if we are not reflectively theoretical. As I said, I think that without theory, our theoretical position is liberal humanism. We describe the novel, we summarize the novel, we talk about the lessons, the moral lessons, conclusions from the novel, what the novel represents. That is, a theoretical treatment. Any kind of simple summarizing, giving a summary of a novel cannot be done without some theoretical commitment. Chris also talks about this distinction between post-structuralism and deconstruction, kind of wants to pause on that synonymy, if they are synonymous. Why? Post-structuralism emphasizes one aspect of that movement. Deconstruction emphasizes another aspect of that movement, or another aspect of that style or tendency, theoretical tendency. Post-structuralism emphasizes that this movement arises from structuralism itself. So the insistence on structures, especially for people who continue this dialectic between text, concrete, and structuralist theory, especially that dialectic, destabilizes those structures, destabilizes their theoretical position. That's why something happens after structuralism. So post-structuralism, it is the outcome of exploring structuralist assumptions. It is the structuralist assumption, it is the structuralist position itself that destabilizes itself, that leads to deconstruction. Deconstruction emphasizes another aspect, like what is happening is attention moving in the direction of not just the center of the text, but the margins, what is being ignored, what is being repressed, what is being not attended but we don't seem to be caring about. But with some attention, we realize that it is actually present. Sometimes the presences that we are ignoring are absences. What is being deconstructed? Structures. So, for example, a deconstruction of certain historical treatments of novels, like this is just a representation of historical moments. That could be deconstructed. And from that deconstruction, what can arise is a sort of liberal humanist attitude. Because the historicist treatment of a novel like Heart of Darkness, if you just view it as a historical reflection or historical colonial representation, just an image of that, what was happening at the time, certain parts of the novel are just left out. You realize we are not being fair to the novel if you just look at it through a historicist perspective. So that historicist perspective deconstructs, we deconstruct it, and we begin to pay attention to other elements, like the element of choice, character development. Okay, last question from Chris. I think if I've missed anything, please remind me and I'll go back. The last thing that Chris brought up was an example of a Japanese movie, Rashomon. I haven't watched it, but he describes the movie as being involving people, a group of people, maybe four individuals, and each individual has one unique, distinct interpretation of the situation, and there's an argument between those four different interpretations. There's a back and forth, and we never reach a center. And I think Chris is asking, is this an example of deconstruction? And no, it's not. This is more an example of something else that I'll cover in this series, and that's modernism and postmodernism. So lack of a center, lack of stability, lack of a univocal content, material. That's more of a reflection of a postmodern condition. In deconstruction, I'll tell you what a deconstructive reading would do. A deconstructive reading would say, despite the differences between these four different interpretations, despite the difference, there might be something that these four characters have in common, and that commonality might be repressed. This is just one example. Or that the difference is that they highlight when we move from one interpretation to another interpretation to another interpretation. When we move between them, we are highlighting some things, and those things that we are highlighting underplay or downplay some other differences, some other subject, some other theme that is being pushed to the margin because of this whole debate, because of this plurality. In essence, deconstructive reading asks, what is it that is being pushed to the margin? Like I said in that reading of Giovanni's Room, what I proposed as a deconstructive reading of Giovanni's Room is something that is not apparent in the first reading or second reading. The disappointment of David, the main character, the narrator, with Giovanni is just completely hidden, and it's hidden very successfully. But with a deconstructive reading, that becomes easier to accept. That is easier to find that persuasive and useful, because it helps make sense of some of the events in the novel. It has to be useful. The deconstructive reading, despite all of its counterintuitiveness, it has to do some work. It has to help us make sense of some of the events that we couldn't make sense of with that naive structuralist or liberal humanist reading of the text, reading of the novel. Okay, I will pause here, and hopefully tomorrow we will move to psychoanalysis. Thank you very much for your attention, for your patience, and let me know what you think, and until next time.